This is Charles from California True Crime, and you're listening to California Dreamin' on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. Creating a podcast isn't that simple. It's more than just recording yourself and uploading it. To really get your show to be everything you want it to be, you're going to need a little more than that. You need easy, reliable hosting so your time can be spent creating your content. The most accurate download stats so you know that you're reaching the audience that you're wanting to. And a web page that makes setting up totally easy on you and won't take up too much of your time. And BLUBRRRY offers all of this and more for hosts and aspiring hosts alike. Simple media hosting, a fully integrated WordPress website with their PowerPress sites. So, if you already have a podcast, or you've always dreamed about starting one, head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up, and the first month is on us. The BLUBRRRY support team is available to walk you through the steps of migrating your show without losing any subscribers, or to help you get started in the process of launching your new show. With the first month for free, using promo code DREAM, you've got no excuses. So let's get started. I first want to take the time to thank a few people who have joined in supporting the production of this show through Patreon. Christina S., Donna S., A. Mia, Lauren S., Sherry M., Melody H., Natalie B., and Amy M. If you would like to gain access to the bonus content on California Dreaming's Patreon, you can for as little as $1 a month. You'll also receive a thank you card with some small gifts from me, depending on which level you join. And we also have an exclusive subscribers-only Facebook page called KD2 Postmortem. So if you join Patreon, make sure you join us over there as well. Visit our page at www.patreon.com/CaliforniaPod. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your support in helping to cover the cost in producing this show. And I need to provide you with this warning. This episode contains graphic details of violence, sexually explicit content, as well as themes involving hate crimes against the transgender community. Listener discretion is strongly advised. When I started thinking about the story for this 61st episode of California Dreaming, I began looking around the internet for some news articles and things related to this story. At the time I began looking, there were some murder cases in the United States that were dominating the news and social media. There was that one guy in Colorado, Chris Watts, who was accused of murdering his wife, Shannon, and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste, and their unborn baby, dumping the two girls in an oil tank and burying their mother and unborn baby in a grave nearby. The other was the murder of 20-year-old Molly Tibbetts in Iowa by Christian Rivera, who has admitted to spotting her jogging along a country road back in July and ended up murdering her, leaving her hidden under some corn stalks, eventually leading authorities to her location. I'm certain that many of you listening, especially here in the United States, have heard about and may even be following these stories. So I got back on track and got back to researching for today's case. And when I started looking around, searching for some keywords related to the story, some very alarming results populated. You see, I didn't exactly remember the last name of the victim of today's story off the top of my head. I just remembered seeing and hearing about it several years ago. I had watched her story on Investigation Discovery, and I remember this case having taken place in Northern California. So when I searched keywords, the results really hit me like a ton of bricks. Many of us have been so inundated with these two high-profile murder cases in our news feeds, it becomes much too easy to miss other murder cases that the media chooses to not report on. And I felt like my internet searches led me to the perfect place that I wanted to start from as we delve into today's 61st episode of California Dreaming, the tale of Gwen Araujo. So, what was my Google search? I entered the words transgender, woman, murder, California. Google didn't even acknowledge the word California in its top results. They were from other places around the country, as well as around the world, but most prolifically in the United States. It was alarming to see the crimes that are being committed against transgender women, particularly transgender women of color, and we simply aren't hearing about it in our mainstream media. You know, while we're following the news of the Watts and the Tibbetts families, all the while in Florida, there had been a series of transgender women murdered in 2018. 4 so far, all of them African American. The first 3 were in Jacksonville, and the 4th and most recent one in Orlando. Of course, the transgender community in Jacksonville are very, very frightened. And the biggest fear is that this could possibly be the work of a serial killer who is targeting trans women of color. 36-year-old Celine Walker was the first reported trans woman murdered in Jacksonville. Her body was discovered in a room at the Extended Stay America Hotel on February 4th, 2018. 38-year-old Antasha English was discovered shot in the abdomen June 1st, 2018. She was found between 2 abandoned buildings in North Jacksonville. 24-year-old Catalina James was found dead in a hotel room at the Quality Inn and Suites on June 24, 2018, only 10 miles from where Celine Walker was discovered at that extended stay. As it stands, it doesn't seem as though the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department believes that the cases are connected, as they don't have any reason to believe that they're related at this point. But community activists think otherwise, and so far, there aren't any viable suspects, at least no one that the sheriff is willing to name publicly. The 4th murder happened in Orlando, Florida. 27-year-old Sasha Garden was found dead at an apartment complex on July 20th, 2018, at around 5 in the morning behind the reserve at the Lake Buchanan Apartments. And what makes this situation worse for victims of violent crimes committed against the transgender community is not only are these stories underreported or not reported at all by the mainstream media, but advocates and outreach coordinators who work with transgender women find that crime victims are marginalized by law enforcement as well, often feeling judged and misgendered. And the reason for this is because, according to police, they have to call people by what's on their identification card. When the report was made regarding Celine Walker's death, her official police description was a 27-year-old male wearing a wig and dressed like a female. And when some of the local television stations picked up the story, that was the description that they reported too. Eventually, the sheriff's office made the correction and identified her as transgender. Transgender people, particularly women of color, are disproportionately victims of hate crimes and hate violence, and the tragedy of their loss is often compounded by the way they are treated in the media and by law enforcement. And dreamers, that's not all. On Thursday, August 30th, 2018, 24-year-old Dejanay Stanton, a trans woman of color, was found shot in the head in an alley on Chicago's South Side. And as I'm writing this, Dejanay is the 17th transgender person killed in the United States so far in 2018. It is very possible that the number of victims is higher if they happen to be misgendered or their killing wasn't reported. 17 in the United States so far this year. In addition to the 4 that I have mentioned already, here are the other 13. Most, but not all, are trans women of color. On January 8, 2018, 42-year-old Krista Lee Steele Newtzelin, a transgender beauty pageant coordinator, was murdered by her husband, who subsequently turned himself in. On January 12, 2018, 33-year-old Vicky Gutierrez was stabbed in her Los Angeles area apartment, and the apartment was subsequently set on fire, trapping her and her dog inside. 29-year-old Kevin Ramirez admitted to the stabbing and setting the fire and is currently charged with murder and arson. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2018, 35-year-old Tanya Harvey was shot to death in Buffalo, New York. On the afternoon of February 24, 2018, 45-year-old Felicia Mitchell was killed with a gunshot wound to the chest in the Edgewater neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio. Sometime in mid-January of 2018, 28-year-old Zachariah Fry went missing in New Mexico. On February 19th, her body was discovered by a rancher named Fidel Montoya, 40 miles outside of Albuquerque, in a trash bin on a roadside. A second body was discovered on February 27th, approximately 2 miles away, and was later identified as Zachariah's roommate, Eugene Ray. On March 26, 2018, 28-year-old Amaya Tyree Berryman was shot multiple times and killed near a motel in East Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On Sunday, April 1, 2018, 29-year-old Sasha Wall was murdered, also shot multiple times in Chesterfield County, South Carolina. She was discovered slumped over in the driver's seat of her car. On the afternoon of May 9, 2018, 18-year-old Carla Flores Pavone was strangled to death in her apartment in Dallas, Texas. On May 13, 2018, 36-year-old Nino Fortson, a transgender man, was shot multiple times and killed following a heated argument in Atlanta, Georgia. On the evening of May 22, 2018, 28-year-old Gigi Pierce was shot and killed in Portland, Oregon. On June 18, 2018, 39-year-old Diamond Stevens was shot in the back of the head and killed in Meridian, Mississippi. On June 23, 2018, 54-year-old Keisha Wells was shot to death in a parking lot in Cleveland, Ohio. And finally, on the same day as the murder of Dejanay Stanton, in the early morning hours of August 30th, 2018, 18-year-old Vontasia Bell was shot and killed. She was discovered lying in the street in Shreveport, Louisiana. About half of these murder cases have a suspect in custody, and none of them I heard about in the news or on social media. It might very well be because many of these tragic cases took place outside of California, but even Vicky Gutierrez, who was murdered earlier this year in Los Angeles, I hadn't heard the news of her story. I got the news about Chris Watts in Colorado. I got the news about Molly Tibbetts in Iowa. Even late last year, I got the news about the Seminole Heights serial killer all the way in Florida. But until I researched this story, I hadn't heard about the potential of a serial killer actively killing transgender women in Jacksonville. These cases just aren't making headlines. I can't list them all, but I can tell you this. In 2017, 28 transgender people were murdered in the United States. 28 transgender people were murdered in the U.S. in 2016 as well. 23 in 2015, and 11 in 2014. So, you get the idea. It's growing at an alarming rate. And keep in mind, these are just the cases that are being reported and accurately identified by law enforcement and the media. This year, the murder rate of trans people in 2018 doesn't appear to be on pace to be worse than the previous 2 years. But just 2 days prior to researching and writing this, you saw that 2 more victims were added to the list, murdered on the same day, August 30th. And a disproportionate number of victims are trans women of color. I was told in a Facebook comment thread earlier this week that the average lifespan of a transgender woman of color is 35, and I did not know this. And so when I started digging more, not only in today's case, but also the growing trend of crimes against the transgender community, the more I realized how little I was aware of. And I knew that it was time for me to bring you Gwen's story. Eddie Araujo was born February 24th, 1985, the second of 4 children, and was named after his father. His parents would divorce when he was only 10 months old. Even from an early age, his mom, Sylvia Guerrero, would say that she knew her boy was different. According to her, he exhibited traits and characteristics that she herself would describe as feminine. As a matter of fact, in an interview she gave several years ago, she said that when she was pregnant, she felt like she was expecting a girl. As a toddler, Eddie liked wearing his older sister's clothes and playing with her toys instead of his own. And from the time that he was in elementary school, all the way through high school, Eddie was relentlessly bullied. Sylvia first thought that her son was gay. But by the time Eddie reached adolescence, he began dressing and identifying as a female. When he turned 14, he had a talk with his mom, telling her that he just doesn't feel like a boy. Inside, he feels like a girl. Mom understood that it was going to be difficult for her son. But fortunately, Sylvia was very loving. She was very open and accepting of what her son was telling her, and very much willing to affirm her child's feelings. So at the age of 14, he began going by the name Gwen. And if the first Gwen to come to your mind is Gwen Stefani, then yes, her new name was inspired by her favorite musician, though she was known to have gone by a couple of different names before settling on Gwen. She grew her hair long and had plans to begin hormone treatments and eventually undergo gender reassignment surgery. Until then, Gwen worked very hard at learning how to expertly apply makeup in order to help soften her facial features, as well as filling her wardrobe with all of her favorite fashions. Once Gwen got to middle school and high school and was openly identifying as a female, the bullying escalated even more, and soon it became unbearable. Despite the fact that Gwen was now identifying as a female, the school would not allow her to use the girls' restroom, and it wasn't safe for Gwen to go into the boys' restroom, where she would be subjected to taunting and name-calling. Gwen did what she could to defend herself. She would be the type to argue back, but she would not stay and fight. She'd prefer to walk away. To her, it wasn't so much that it was ever making her feel down about herself and who she was. She would just be mad at the ridiculousness of the fact that people couldn't deal with who she was. Gwen ended up transferring to an alternative high school, but ended up dropping out before the start of the 2002 school year. Her mother, Sylvia, noticed the struggles that Gwen faced and how they were taking a toll on her overall personality. Gwen, who had once been a very sweet and happy and loving person, had grown to become quite angry at the world. I spoke to a person who reached out to me, who has much more understanding and experience in working with and advocating for the transgender community, and he explained that this shift in personality is common, but can often be attributed to post-traumatic stress caused by the bullying and the rejection experienced before, during, and after transitioning. But Gwen still had her dreams, and she had her aspirations of going on to cosmetology school with the hopes of working as a makeup artist in Hollywood, like a makeup artist to the stars. And once she finished with her hormone therapy and was able to complete the gender reassignment surgery, her intentions were to have her birth certificate officially changed to reflect her gender and her name. So at the age of 17, Gwen happily walked away from high school, never wanting to look back. She was glad to be free of the burden and was ready to begin enjoying life. Gwen and her best friend Chrissy spent as much time as they could going out and partying and trying to meet older guys who would buy them alcohol. The town they lived in, Newark, California, was only 35 miles or 56 kilometers away from San Francisco, the big city that they loved to party in. They'd almost always go out at night. Their intentions were to meet and hang out with guys, and with the cover of darkness, they could not only lie about their ages, but Gwen's more masculine features were more easily obscured. Gwen and Chrissy were aware that their activities could be risky and could potentially bring trouble their way, but you know how teenagers can be, and they often think they're immortal. And the girls were no exception. They figured together that they would be able to take care of each other and get out of any trouble that might find them. Their main goal was to just have as much fun as possible, all the while throwing caution to the wind. So, enter into the story 3 young men who were pretty much best friends: Michael Magidson, Jason Cazares, and José Meré. They spend most nights together, hanging out, usually at José Meré's home, which is somewhat of a bachelor pad that he shares with his 2 brothers. This is the preferred place for the 3 of them to party or drink or do whatever they do. They are a very tight-knit trio of friends. However, they did eventually make room for a 4th guy, a guy by the name of Jaron Nabors. He was a college student who worked as a waiter, and he was at least 3, maybe 4 years younger than the rest of the guys. So because he was younger, and he really wanted to be in with these 3 friends, he tried hard to fit in, to become a part of their little group. It's been described that he sometimes tried too hard, and they seemed to like him for the most part. He did have a girlfriend, and they did have a baby together, but he spent much of his free time partying with his newfound friends, which I don't know how well that went over with his girlfriend, but whatever. He prefers being with these guys. They drank, they smoked weed, they played dominoes, they went drinking at bars, they enjoyed meeting women. Those are pretty much the goals for each evening. So, one summer night of 2002, Gwen and Chrissy were hanging out at a convenience store. It was apparently a thing that they did in order to try and meet guys or to catch a ride to a party. That doesn't exactly sound like the wisest choice of evening activities, but that's what the girls did. They were all dressed up, full makeup, hair, all that, ready for wherever the night would take them. And this is where they would cross paths with those 4 friends: Magidson, Cazares, Meré, and Nabors. The guys saw the girls and pulled up to talk to them. According to Chrissy, these guys just drove up. They had some good music playing on the radio. they seemed like they were ready for a good time. And then they invited Gwen and Chrissy to jump in and come hang out with them. So the girls just got in the car and went along. With these strangers they literally just met. The group headed back to José Morel's dedicated bachelor pad to party. Gwen, however, told these guys a couple of lies, which is what she usually does. She told him that she was 19, she was actually 17, and she told him that her name was Lita. But for the duration of the story, I am going to call her Gwen, despite the fact that they only knew her as Lita. When they all arrived back at the house, they of course started drinking, smoking, listening to music. And the guys all do find Gwen to be a very attractive woman, which she was. Gwen was incredibly beautiful, and I will post pictures of her on social media after this episode is released. And before long, Gwen became a regular at the party house. And as the summer wore on, Michael Magidson soon became quite smitten with Gwen. And eventually he tried to seduce her, but so does José Morel. Both men were very attracted to Gwen, but their personalities kind of played a role in how each of them attempted to get closer to her. Magidson has been described as kind of a cocky, spoiled, entitled type, who usually tries to present himself as having a tough, aggressive personality. Morel, however, is quieter. He's more laid back, more reserved than Magidson. But neither one of them seems to have the slightest inkling that Gwen is a transgender woman. Technically a girl, as she's still only 17. Those who knew Gwen described her as fun-loving, outgoing, lively, vivacious. Effervescent is a very accurate way of describing her personality. Men were very easily attracted to her, and Magidson and Morel were no exception. And I can't emphasize enough how gorgeous Gwen was. Her hair, her makeup, her clothes, her style, everything was always on point. Remember, it was her dream to be a stylist and a makeup artist. She was her own canvas, and she nearly perfected her craft. And Gwen very much knew how to draw the attention of men. She was very flirtatious, and she enjoyed every minute of the attention men paid to her. Remember how Gwen's mom described her as going from a happy, fun-loving teenager into a very angry and jaded person? Well, she seemed to have found that these new friends of hers helped lift her spirits up emotionally. She was feeling better, not so down, not so angry. Magidson and Merrill always wanted Gwen to hang out with them, and Gwen very much wanted to be there as well, all the while being able to maintain her secrets. All of this was happening at a very tumultuous time in Gwen's life. She was only 17, and she had to drop out of high school because she could not take the unyielding bullying from her classmates and peers. She was feeling shunned and shut out by the world, and the unwillingness of people to accept her as a woman. Her mom, Sylvia, knew that she struggled and could hardly do anything but stand by and watch as Gwen fell apart right before her eyes. She knew Gwen had started drinking and smoking marijuana, and Sylvia was a single mom who worked long hours as a legal assistant, supporting her 3 children on her own. Sylvia, from the very beginning, affirmed Gwen's identity as a woman. But Gwen's high-risk behaviors put a tremendous amount of strain on their relationship. There had been an incident where Sylvia had to rush to Gwen's aid when she was at a party with some men who came to realize that she was transgender. Of course, Mom was upset. Who wouldn't be? She feared for Gwen's safety. She understood the risks that Gwen was taking by finding herself in situations like this. You never know how someone is going to react when they feel like they've been tricked or misled. Gwen and her mother fought all the way home over this. Her mom telling her that she just can't put herself in danger like this. But it all would fall on deaf ears. Gwen struggled with bouts of what her family described as depression over her identity, though she was never diagnosed as depressed. Her dispositions and her moods would certainly have manifested as a result of the bullying or the rejection. By and large, she was unaccepted by people in general, and so she turned to this partying lifestyle with men that she didn't really know all that well, who, in turn, didn't know her either. It made her feel good about herself, that attention that she got, that she craved and desired. Her identity as a woman in her mind was being validated by these men. As I stated earlier, both Michael Magidson and José Meré were both vying for Gwen's affections. But José Meré seemed to be the one who had the most feelings for Gwen. If you recall, I told you that he was the quieter, more mild-mannered of the two. And they did have some intimate encounters. But Michael Magidson, the more aggressive of the two, was also very attracted to Gwen and had also been intimate with her as well. Michael Magidson did say that he had sexual intercourse with Gwen, and although José Meré never openly said that he did, it has been reported that he did too. But despite both of them having sexual encounters with Gwen, neither one of them ever saw her fully undressed. It would later be revealed that Magidson did engage in oral sex with Gwen, and Meré engaged in anal sex. Gwen reportedly told each of them that she was menstruating, and if they attempted to reach for her genitalia, she would push their hands away. But not everyone at this party house was convinced that Gwen was who she said she was. As the summer began to bleed into fall, some doubts began to bubble up to the surface, even from very early on. Jaron Nabors, the youngest of the group, the one with the girlfriend and the baby, he was skeptical. So much so that he told the guys that he thought Gwen was, in his words, a dude, asking them what they thought. They all brushed him off, and they told him that there was no way that a guy could be that hot. They eventually dismissed the conversation, but his comments did plant a seed of doubt, and that seed would eventually grow. One evening in September of 2002, Gwen was involved in an altercation with a woman named Nicole Brown. She was the girlfriend of José Meré's older brother, Paul, and she was often a guest at the party house as well. And it was because of this altercation with Gwen that Nicole Brown began to have her doubts about her identity as a female as well. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, Nicole admitted that she had never been in a fight with another girl and lost. And I'm thinking as I'm reading this, how many fights has this young woman been in? I have no idea, but I gather she thinks of herself as being pretty tough and able to hold her own in a confrontation. It was also common knowledge that Nicole did not like Gwen at all. She didn't like that Gwen suddenly came out of nowhere and began hanging out at the house all the time and had all but taken over the attention of all the guys that they partied with. So at some point that night, Gwen had gotten on top of a table and began dancing and gyrating in the manner in which perhaps an exotic dancer might do so. The guys were hooting and hollering, egging Gwen on as she danced for them. So Nicole shouted at Gwen to take off her top. At first, Gwen just tried to play it off and continued with what she was doing. Of course, she didn't want to take her top off, and she tried to laugh and smile and keep going. But Nicole wouldn't let up. She continued to taunt Gwen, and she was getting more verbally aggressive while doing so. And Gwen had finally had enough. Losing her temper, a physical fight ensued between Nicole and Gwen. Now, Nicole is described as being much, much larger in size and stature than Gwen. So when Gwen not only easily overpowered Nicole and followed that up with a powerful blow, knocking her to the ground, leaving her stunned at the strength that Gwen demonstrated. And it would be this physical altercation that Nicole's doubts about Gwen surfaced. In her own words, she described Gwen as so strong that she fought like a guy. Gwen, so upset at what just happened, ran out of the house and burst into tears. She ran home and told her mom what had happened. Naturally, her mom became very upset. Not so much about the fight, but her worries for Gwen's safety were growing. And they were only compounded when altercations like this happened between Gwen and her so-called friends. She's afraid that in hiding the fact that she's a transgender female, that it's going to eventually upset the wrong person. And that person just might lose their temper and try to harm Gwen in retaliation. Her mom just couldn't shake the feeling that Gwen was playing with fire. And if she wasn't careful, she was gonna get burned. Meanwhile, the guys back at the party house began talking about what they had witnessed in this fight with Gwen and Nicole. They saw the strength with which Gwen fought. They described it just as Nicole had. In their words, she really fought like a man. A whole lot of power in her punch. The guys also began talking about being intimate with Gwen. If you recall, both Michael Magidson and José Meré both had sexual encounters with Gwen. And the two men began comparing notes about their experiences with her. Their individual encounters with Gwen were approximately 2 weeks apart, and she told both men that she could engage in oral or anal sex only because she was menstruating. And they obviously quickly did the math and realized that it would be unlikely that Gwen would be menstruating while she was intimate with both of them in the span of only 2 weeks. They began thinking of all the little clues that were leading them to believe that Gwen might have been assigned male gender at birth and is now a transgender female. They looked at all the things that they noticed. They listed some of the pros and cons. And as we talked about earlier, Gwen was a stunningly beautiful woman. But the more they talked, the more they began to feel like Gwen was keeping the truth from them. The conversation then became, what are we going to do if they find out that Gwen is transgender? For them, this would be unacceptable. If they had known, they would not have engaged in sexual intercourse with her. They decided that they needed to get to the bottom of this, and if they were to find out that Gwen was assigned male at birth, they were going to, quote, do something about it. They finally let the matter go for now, but the issue was still lingering, and they would eventually go on to confront Gwen about it. Now, dreamers, keep in mind that Gwen has no idea that anyone suspects that she may be transgender. She is continuing to deal with ongoing problems with her mom, lecturing her about engaging in high-risk behaviors, wanting her to stop all of the hard partying and drinking that she was doing. Sylvia was so afraid that Gwen was going to get hurt, or worse. Her mom wanted to confront Gwen's alcohol and drug use. She could see that Gwen's life was spiraling, and she desperately wanted to try to get Gwen into a rehab facility. She tried her best to remind Gwen that she has a bright future to look forward to. She has hopes and aspirations of becoming a cosmetologist and a stylist to the stars. She tried to make a deal with Gwen. If she can get a job and hold it down, then Mom would pay to put her through cosmetology school. Gwen does like the idea of getting a job, so she could eventually save up for the surgery to affirm her gender, which is something that she desperately wanted. Gwen submitted job application after job application, and she did get a few calls to come in for interviews. But the name that was written on the applications was Eddie Araujo, so when Gwen would show up, the interviews would quickly go south. And to compound that, she was a high school dropout, and she had no work experience. The cards were stacked against her, and she quickly saw her hopes of earning and saving money for her surgery getting dashed. She took it very hard. So hard, in fact, in order to help herself cope with it. She turned back to drugs, but this time, some harder stuff. Specifically, crystal methamphetamines. She again sank back into what her family described as a depressive state, though I remind you she was never officially diagnosed with depression. And she was also in a state of hopelessness. Gwen got to the point where she was doing anything to feel better about the skin she was in. Not only using drugs, but chasing after that validation that she felt when she was with Michael Magidson and José Meré. On the night of October 3rd, 2002, while Gwen was getting ready to go out and party with the guys, they were getting ready to go out to a club that night. José Meré told the guys that later on that evening, Gwen would be coming over to hang out. They all decided that after they got back to the house and met up with Gwen, that they were going to take that opportunity to confront her about their lingering doubts about her. And for some reason on this particular night, Gwen decided to make some daring wardrobe changes. Normally, she wore jeans. However, on this night, she opted for a miniskirt. She also decided to not wear the choker that she usually wore around her neck in order to cover up her Adam's apple. Gwen's mom saw her in the miniskirt and told her that she wanted her to change and wear jeans because her legs appeared masculine, and she was worried that people would notice, but Gwen refused. Gwen got on the phone with her best friend Chrissy and told her that she was getting ready and heading out over to the guy's house. She told her that she was going to wear a miniskirt, and Chrissy expressed the same concerns that Gwen's mom had, telling her that she just didn't think it was a good idea, that she never wears skirts, and she wasn't sure that she could pull it off. But Gwen wasn't having it. She insisted that she looked really cute in this outfit. So after brushing off her mom and her best friend, Gwen set off for the party house. And for reasons I could not ascertain, Chrissy did not go with Gwen that night to the guy's house. She ended up going alone. While Gwen was anxious to meet up with Michael Magidson and José Meré, they all weren't really that anxious to hurry back from where they were at to see her. They were out drinking and drinking a lot. Their bar crawl ended around 2 a.m, and they made their way back to the house. They knew Gwen was there, and they were bound and determined to find out the truth about her. While Gwen was waiting for them to arrive back at the house, she had spent the evening hanging out with Nicole Brown, the same young woman with whom she had gotten into that physical fight with a couple of weeks earlier. And as you might imagine, the situation was kind of awkward. Nicole's boyfriend, José's brother Paul, and another brother of theirs were asleep in the bedroom. So Gwen wasn't exactly having the time of her life waiting for the guys to get there. So when they finally did arrive in the very early morning hours of October 4th, 2002, Gwen, who had ever since she'd met the group quickly became the life of the party and the center of attention, was glad that they were finally there and was ready to get this party started. However, it became apparent to Gwen that something was a bit off with the guys. They weren't as excited as they usually were to see her, and she could tell right away that the mood continued to be awkward. And you know and I know, it's because over the past couple of weeks, since the physical altercation with Nicole, they had been wondering about Gwen's gender identity. Remember, Gwen still has no idea that these guys are suspicious of her. And even though she sees that they're being kind of distant from her on this night, she really doesn't pick up on the hints that something might be wrong. So, it seemed like the guys were just trying to get on with their night. Maybe trying to find a casual way to steer the conversation towards their questions and doubts about Gwen. The guys set up to play a game of dominoes, not really paying the usual attention to her. Gwen does what she can to try to garner their attention, wanting to try to break up their game, but they really aren't biting. And it's kind of actually the opposite reaction she normally receives. They begin to become a little agitated with the whole scene, and then the mood turns somewhat tense. The guys really want to know the truth. Finally, José Morel had had enough. If you recall, of the two men who had a strong attraction to Gwen, it was he who seemed to have the strongest liking to her. Michael Magidson did as well, but it was my impression that Morel's feelings ran a little bit deeper. He was the first one to finally speak up and ask Gwen for the truth. He wanted to know, and he shouted, quote, "Are you a man or what?" Gwen, probably in the moment, knew that they knew, but all she said in response was, "Why are you asking me this? What are you guys talking about? This is crazy. What makes you think this?" But they all began to press her for answers, and the questions became more pointed and aggressive. They began demanding to know. The argument began to escalate, and they insisted to get a straight answer from Gwen. They were pressuring her to reveal her gender to the group, but she refused to do so. So Nicole Brown made the suggestion that maybe one of them could take a look for themselves in private. Maybe not necessarily have Gwen disrobe, but perhaps feel. With more and more pressure being placed upon Gwen, the situation was beginning to boil over. So Gwen agreed to go into the bathroom with Michael Magidson to speak with him privately. He told her that José had had a lot to drink and that he was really upset about the questions surrounding her gender identity, and he was not going to let up until she would be willing to prove to him whether or not she has been honest with them. He asked her to either show him or allow him to touch her genital area, but again she refused. She tried to explain that she wasn't ready to show him or any of them what they were asking for, that she wasn't ready, she wasn't comfortable. Gwen was scrambling for a way to get out of this in order to not have to actually show herself to Michael Magidson in that bathroom. He told her that he understood that it would be uncomfortable to have to reveal herself to the entire group, and so he asked her again to just show him, and he would be able to let the others know that he saw for himself. But Gwen continued to make excuses. eventually just flat out refusing to show herself. Gwen and Magidson were reportedly in the bathroom for approximately a half hour. It's not clear what was going on for the entire time, but it's my understanding that they continued to go back and forth about Gwen either revealing herself or allowing Magidson to see for himself what the truth was about her gender identity. After a while, Magidson became frustrated and exasperated with Gwen, and he exited the bathroom and rejoined the others at the table where they had been playing dominoes. While Gwen and Magidson were in the bathroom, José Meré had confessed to the group, including to Nicole Brown, that he had sex with Gwen. Now, the following is an account of what occurred based on reports given by Nicole. According to her, the confrontation with Gwen began around 3:30 in the morning. Nicole and her boyfriend, Paul Meré, were in the bedroom about to go to sleep when they heard some agitated voices coming from another part of the house. She decided to get out of bed to see what was going on. She saw the confrontation between the guys and Gwen, and according to her, in her words, they repeatedly asked her if she was a man. And as I stated, Gwen was not answering this question. So Nicole would say that it was she who suggested that one of them go into the bathroom with Gwen and in private find out. And that's when Michael Magidson and Gwen went into the restroom for that half hour. And this is when Nicole found out that at least 2 of the guys had had sex with Gwen. Now, Nicole Brown has stated in an interview that she tried to assure them that Gwen was definitely a woman, but I'm not sure I believe that because she was one of the first to doubt Gwen's gender identity following that punch she took from her a couple of weeks earlier. Now, I've read one other report that Michael Magidson emerged from the bathroom exasperated that he wasn't able to get any answers from Gwen, leaving her in the bathroom alone. But I read another report that it was Nicole Brown who, after the half hour had passed with the 2 of them in there talking, that she was the one who grew impatient and decided to barge in on them. She described finding Gwen sitting on the counter next to the sink, and she seemed to be very intoxicated. Now again, I've read 2 different accounts of what happened next. It's been said that Nicole Brown discovered Gwen was a transgender woman by either touching or grabbing at her genital area. But Nicole, in an interview she gave, said that she went in there and questioned Gwen, demanded answers, and this had gone on for far too long, and Gwen would not answer her, so she said that she pushed open Gwen's legs as she sat on the bathroom countertop. As you recall, I mentioned that this was the first time Gwen opted to wear a miniskirt rather than jeans. So, it's plausible that this may have happened, but I don't know. I understand that she is saying Gwen is intoxicated, but I'm not sure that it would be plausible to be able to tell from just a quick glance that she would be able to ascertain that Gwen was a transgender female. But that was Nicole's story. I believe it was stated by the others at the house that night that Nicole Brown physically touched or grabbed at Gwen. Either way, after she determined that Gwen was indeed transgender, she hurried back into the room where the guys had been playing dominoes and exclaimed, and this is according to her interview and in her own words, "It's a man, oh my God." José Meré immediately became hysterical upon learning this. He began sobbing uncontrollably, and he would later describe that she was not the woman that he thought that he had had a sexual encounter with, and the thought of it disgusted him. He had grown very attracted to her in the 2 months or so since he'd met her, and when he learned the truth, he claims he became physically ill, and shortly afterwards, he ran into the bathroom and vomited. While all of this was going on, Michael Magidson, Jason Cazares, and Jaron Nabors stepped outside the house to have a smoke. Nicole claims that she tried to calm José Meré down, to try to convince him that it was going to be okay, that this wasn't his fault, that she knows him. They went to high school together. They were really good friends, and this doesn't change anything about him. To not worry about it, to just try to let things go, and to hopefully just let this night end without getting angry or getting into a fight. Now, I don't know if she was genuinely saying these things to him. These were her claims in her interview, but she might have genuinely been trying to calm him down. But it was clear that the men who engaged in sexual relations with Gwen were furious. Nicole Brown has stated that she tried to warn Gwen that she had better hurry up and get away from the house as quickly as possible, to run as fast as she could. So, heeding her warning, Gwen exited the bathroom and attempted to make her way out the front door to leave. But a few seconds later, Nicole saw Gwen come back into the house. Magidson, Cazares, and Nabors, who were outside smoking, prevented Gwen from leaving and ordered her back inside. Nicole would later claim that she encouraged the guys to let Gwen go, to just let her walk out the door. José Merrill's brother, Emmanuel, would later claim that he attempted to help Gwen leave the house safely, but was prevented in doing so by both Magidson and Nabors. After the men had Gwen back in the house, Michael Magidson began grabbing at her, attempting to pull at her clothing so he could expose her genitals. Gwen attempted to protect herself by curling up and trying to keep her clothes in place, but Magidson managed to expose Gwen to everyone looking on as they struggled. It was then Magidson began punching and slapping Gwen in the face, which caused her to fall to the ground. And then he wrapped his arm around her neck and put her in a chokehold. Some of the others managed to pull Magidson off of Gwen, but as they struggled to calm an out-of-control Magidson, Gwen begged for them to stop, to please stop, telling them that she has a family. Heartbreaking, as Gwen is being pummeled, her thoughts immediately go to her family, whom she knows are going to be devastated if she is hurt or worse. But her pleas were ignored. José Merrill grabbed an unopened can of soup that was sitting nearby in the kitchen and hit Gwen in the head with it with so much force that he dented the can. Her head split open and blood began pouring out of the wound. Gwen, as she screamed and cried and begged for them to stop, Merrill then found a frying pan and smashed Gwen in the head again. The last words that came from Gwen, as José Merrill struck her with the frying pan, were, "I told you I was sorry." At some point during all of this, Nicole decided that she wanted no part anymore. The guys were becoming angry, and it was looking as though the situation was likely to escalate even more so, and quickly. She didn't feel like she was going to be able to stop them. She only knew Paul, her boyfriend, and José, his brother, and she didn't think that they would do anything to harm Gwen, but she wasn't familiar with the other guys, and she just wanted to leave. She went to her boyfriend, Paul Merrill's room, to wake him up, and Paul, it seems, was on probation at the time. For what? I don't know. But she was concerned that he would get in big trouble if he had any part in this, or was even present in the home, and she didn't want to have him get a probation violation. And as for herself, apparently she was the mother of 2 children of her own, and she certainly didn't need to be a party to this attack on Gwen either. Now, I was kind of surprised when I read that detail about Nicole having 2 kids. I don't know, maybe I was being a little bit judgy, but her lifestyle these late nights, the partying, spending nights at her boyfriend's house, all the fighting, all the other antics. I was like, where are your kids at? But anyway, yeah. Her children became of great concern all of a sudden when she found herself in the midst of this brutal attack on Gwen. And it suddenly dawned on her like, oh shit, I better get home to my kids, right? So she, her boyfriend Paul, and his brother Emmanuel left. These two both are brothers of José Merrill, with whom he shares the party house with, and they all just left, which kinda surprised me. I would be more inclined to think that they would both try to intervene and stop their brother from attacking Gwen to prevent him from getting into some serious trouble for what he was doing. But I don't know. I don't have siblings, so I can't speak to the nature of sibling relationships. But for all intents and purposes, they seemed close and protective. However, the two brothers chose to leave instead of stepping in. And after they left, Nicole stated that they stopped at a convenience store and purchased a couple of items and then drove approximately 25 miles or 40 kilometers to her apartment in Livermore. I did read another report that they drove to a friend's house and crashed there for the night. I also read that it was only Nicole and Paul that left, but not Emmanuel. So whichever story is most accurate, I can't be certain. But for this story, these are generally minor details. And don't forget, everyone is either drunk, high, half asleep, or all of the above, so slight variations are to be expected. After José Merrill struck Gwen with the frying pan, Jaron, Nabors, and Jason Cazares took Magison's truck and drove to Cazares' house to retrieve 3 shovels and a pickaxe. As they left, it was around the same time that Nicole, Paul, and Emmanuel were leaving as well, and they purportedly told them that they were going to, quote, kill this bitch, unquote. When they got back to the house after retrieving those items, they entered back into the home, finding Gwen semi-conscious, sitting very still and very quiet, eerily seated on the sofa, with her hands folded in her lap and blood covering her entire face. José Merrill, not wanting Gwen to bleed all over his sofa, ordered her to get off the couch. Once she was down, Cazares and Nabors egged Magidson and Merrill to, quote, knock the bitch out. So Magidson proceeded to punch Gwen 2 more times in the head, and he kneed her with such force that her body was rammed into the wall, the impact leaving a significant dent and cracking the plaster. And these blows rendered Gwen completely unconscious at this point. Cazares then took a turn and kicked Gwen as well. José Merrill then began trying to scrub the bloodstains off the sofa, and according to him, when he was done, he went to his room because he was upset and didn't want the other guys to see him crying. Magidson then retrieved a length of rope from the garage and used it to bind Gwen's wrists and ankles. Again, worried about Gwen bleeding all over the carpet now that she was lying on the ground there, the 3, Merrill, Magidson, and Nabors, went into one of the bedrooms, retrieved a large comforter, and together wrapped Gwen in it. Then they dragged her out to the garage. Again, the story gets a little murky, with the different participants in this brutal attack have given different versions of what occurred. According to Nabors, he said that Magidson strangled Gwen with a rope and that Cazares hit her with a shovel, but he said he didn't actually witness Magidson strangling Gwen, but he saw Magidson look as though he was preparing to put the rope around her neck as he was leaving the garage area at that moment. He was later told by the others that Magidson was the one who wrapped the rope around her neck and began twisting it like a garrote. And what nobody who participated in this brutal attack on Gwen seems to know is exactly at what point Gwen's life ended. They didn't know if it was when she was strangled with the rope, or if it was when, according to neighbors, that Cazares struck Gwen with the shovel. But he was fairly certain that when he did strike her with the shovel, that she was dead. As one of them apparently noticed that after those last strikes to Gwen, she lost control of her bodily functions. Her forehead was split open, and her skull was crushed to the point that her brain was visible. Michael Magidson would tell a different story as well. He claimed that it was Jaron Nabors who was the one who strangled Gwen with the rope and followed that up with striking her with the shovel. Jason Cazares also denied striking her with the shovel, and he also would claim that he was not a witness to Gwen's death. José Merrill claimed that he was busy cleaning Gwen's blood from the sofa and the carpet at the time that Michael Magidson was using that rope to bind Gwen, and this was prior to them taking her into the garage. It was also his belief that Gwen was still alive at that point, but really nobody was able to tell with any degree of certainty when she actually died. And Merrill stated that Magidson told him that he wasn't sure if she was dead or not until they hit Gwen with the shovel. So next, the four of them loaded Gwen into the bed of Magidson's pickup truck. They drove approximately 4 hours to the northeast towards the Sierra Nevada mountains, close to the Nevada border, in the El Dorado National Forest. At least 2 of the guys were familiar with the area, as they had gone camping there before and were aware that the area was sparsely populated and was only patrolled by one sheriff. As they drove, they made one stop to fill up the gas tank and also to cover Gwen up again as her feet had become exposed during the long drive. According to neighbors, when they arrived at the place that they were going to leave Gwen's body, Magidson told him that he had wrapped the rope around Gwen's neck and twisted it to ensure that she was dead, but he wasn't certain yet if she was or not. But again, once Cazares struck Gwen with the shovel, it was then that they were all certain that she was no longer alive. Neighbors said Cazares told him that he hit her with the shovel, and he remembered it well because he described that he was disgusted when he did it because he saw her urinate on herself. And so, when they got to the place that they were going to leave her, they began digging. As neighbors would later tell it, they dug until they could not dig anymore. Michael Magidson would be the one who pulled Gwen from the bed of the truck and dragged her over to the grave that they had dug. Together, all 4 of them covered her body with large rocks, dirt, and a large section of a tree trunk, all the while continuing to make demeaning remarks about Gwen. All of them were still so angry with her deceit, especially Magidson and Meré, as they were the 2 that had been intimate with Gwen and were left feeling as though that they had engaged in sexual intercourse with a man, and the thought of that disgusted them as much as it enraged them. So much so that before they covered Gwen's body, José Meré kicked her a couple more times for good measure. Once the 4 friends were finished, they headed home. But you know, when you're busy pummeling, strangling, beating, kicking, binding, and burying a person, naturally you work up an appetite, right? So these guys stopped by McDonald's and ordered some breakfast. I think Gwen's uncle, David Guerrero, said it the best when he learned of the details of what these 4 men did to Gwen. He said, quote, "It seems when you've heard the worst, you hear more. They had no regard for anything, no remorse. They were most interested in how they would stay clean and get some food." Sometime later that morning, Nicole Brown spoke to José Meré by phone. She asked him what ended up happening, and all he told her was, quote, "Let's just say Gwen took a very long walk home." And with that, for at least a couple of days, no one spoke of Gwen's murder to anyone, nor did anyone report the crime to law enforcement. The guys were under the impression that because Gwen was transgender, that nobody would care that she was missing. But oh, were they ever so wrong. This would not be the case, as Gwen was very much loved by her family, unconditionally. When she failed to arrive home the day after she left to go to that party house, her mom, Sylvia, contacted police to file a missing persons report. But according to her, she didn't feel like law enforcement was taking her missing persons case seriously, in part because Gwen was transgender, but also because she was known to be out and away from home overnight on a regular basis. It didn't take long for rumors to start swirling around that there had been a girl who was exposed as being transgender while attending a house party and was subsequently beaten and strangled to death as a result, and then buried somewhere near Lake Tahoe. By the 9th of October, 5 days after Gwen's murder, her family contacted law enforcement and gave them the information that they had received about the house party rumors and potential people to take a closer look at. Police were beginning to finally take Gwen's case seriously and started interviewing some of those who were known to have attended the party, as well as those who had heard about the confrontation that occurred over Gwen's gender identity. Eventually, one person investigators spoke with took them to the Morell's party house. And while that part of the investigation was going on, a friend of Jaron Nabors had noticed that he wasn't really behaving normally. He seemed to be kind of upset and distraught over something. Eventually, Nabors ended up divulging to this friend what he and the 3 others had done to Gwen. Fortunately, this friend was not going to keep quiet about this information. The friend ended up reporting what Nabors had told him to police. They asked the friend if he would be willing to wear a wire and speak to Nabors about it more, and the friend agreed. The recording captured audio of Nabors making incriminating statements about Gwen's murder. He was subsequently picked up and brought in for questioning. Investigators confronted him with the evidence that they had from the secret recordings, and it was at that point, on October 15th, 11 days after Gwen went missing, that he agreed to lead them to where she was buried. Investigators were sent to the crime scene to recover Gwen's body and to the party house to make some arrests. Those who were arrested in the beginning were Michael Magidson, Jaron Nabors, José Meré, and his older brother, Paul Meré. But Paul was quickly released when Nicole Brown contacted law enforcement to let him know that he had an alibi, that he had left the home with her that evening, and had no part in Gwen's murder. Their other brother, Emmanuel, contacted police as well, but only after Paul was arrested. Don't forget, all these people, Nicole, Paul, and Emmanuel, never made any contact with law enforcement about what they knew regarding Gwen's disappearance and subsequent murder until arrests were made. But detectives and prosecutors decided not to press charges on them, but rather use them as witnesses in the upcoming trials. charges against Paul Meré were dropped the following day, and on October 17th, 2002, Michael Magidson, Jaron Nabors, and José Meré were charged with murder. But there was still one more person who had a hand in Gwen's death: Jason Cazares. Cazares hadn't been implicated in his role in Gwen's murder up to this point. However, while Nabors was in Santa Rita Jail in Dublin, California, he penned a letter to his girlfriend in which he wrote that he and his friends had talked about devising a, quote, soprano-type plan to kill the bitch and get rid of her body, unquote. And in case you aren't aware of the Soprano reference, it was an HBO television crime drama that evolved around a fictional Italian mobster named Tony Soprano, based in New Jersey, that ran from 1999 to 2007. And it is considered to be one of the greatest, best-written television series of all time. So anyway, also in this letter, Nabors explained his innocence in the case to his girlfriend, but he also named Jason Cazares as a witness to Gwen's murder. The letter was intercepted by the jail staff on October 22nd, and this eventually led to the arrest of Cazares on November 19th, 2002. Jaron Nabors would go on to reach a plea deal with the prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter, Nabors would also provide his compelling and powerful account of what happened the night Gwen was murdered and testify against his 3 friends. Many of the details of that evening came from Nabors. The way the attack on Gwen unfolded, as I described earlier, much of that was his account. Prosecutors, as well as Gwen's family attorney, Gloria Allred, believed him to be a credible witness. But it would remain unclear from his testimony whether the plan he alluded to in the letter was actually made, making this a premeditated event. He said that the 4 of them debated at least a week before Gwen's death about the truth regarding her gender identity. Eventually, they all agreed and came to the conclusion that, quote, something bad should happen to any man who dresses like a woman, especially if she meets a really bad guy, unquote. He recalled the disturbing details of how José Meré struck Gwen with a can of soup and then with what he described as a metal skillet. Earlier, I said it was a frying pan, and since then, I've seen it described as a skillet. I'm not clear as to which one it was. I mean, either way, both could do considerable amounts of damage, but if it was a metal skillet, such as a wrought iron skillet, for example, that would certainly cause much more damage than a standard frying pan. Nabors also described in heartbreaking detail how Gwen, as she was being attacked, begged for her life, crying, "No, please don't. I have a family." He described his friends to the court, that he knew of them to have been in fights before, and he knew that they would be furious if they were to find out that Gwen had been deceiving them. He said that they were not the type of people who would allow someone to wrong them and let that person get away with it. He testified on the evening of Gwen's death. He heard José Meré say, quote, "I swear, if it's a man, I'm going to kill him. If it's a man, she ain't leaving," unquote. He testified that after Magidson had become fed up in trying to get Gwen to reveal herself to him, that Nicole Brown was the one who went into the bathroom and physically grabbed Gwen's genitals and came out of the bathroom shouting, "It's a man." And that's when neighbors saw Gwen emerge from the bathroom with her head hanging down, in his words, quote, looking like someone whose secret had just come out. He said when Gwen tried to leave, she was prevented by doing so by Magidson and Cazares. Neighbors witnessed Magidson begin punching Gwen in the face, causing her to fall to the ground. and then he pulled her skirt down and her underwear, at which point he put her in a chokehold. Neighbors added that the chokehold was a maneuver that Magidson had been practicing executing a number of times on him prior to the night of the murder. And while Magidson was attacking Gwen, José Meré had become hysterical, crying, quote, "I can't be f***ing gay." And it was not long after that, still hysterical and still angry, Meré grabbed the can and the skillet that he used to beat Gwen with about the head. And that was when he and Cazares went to Cazares' home to retrieve the shovels and pickaxe. When they returned, he saw Gwen still semi-conscious, that José Meré was cleaning up the blood, and then the attack on Gwen resumed. They bound her with rope, they wrapped her in the comforter, they dragged her into the garage where Magidson continued to bind her with the rope, wrapping it around her neck and twisting it until they thought that she was deceased. And then the four of them made that 4-hour drive where they dug her shallow grave and buried her. Jaron Nabors, for his plea and his testimony, received a sentence of 11 years in prison. Though he was warned that if he failed to live up to his obligations to testify, that his plea could be rescinded and he would be made to face the charge of murder. He acknowledged that he understood. And for Gwen's family, Nabors' deal could not have fallen on a more perfect day. The day that Gwen would have turned 18 years old. His plea deal brought the family a great deal of comfort, and they found reason, finally, to celebrate something in this tragedy. The day of Nabors' hearing and sentencing, Gwen's family arrived outside of the courthouse with happy birthday balloons in her honor. Jaron Nabors' attorney explained that his client realized that he would be taking a risk being sent to prison for a very long time, if not for the rest of his life if he decided to take his case to trial. His client accepted responsibility for his role in Gwen's murder, but he did point out that Nabors did not take part in the assault that ultimately led to Gwen's death. But in his letter to his girlfriend, he did implicate himself in a number of matters after the killing, which is why this was the best option to plead guilty and to agree to testify. His admissions in his letter would have been more than enough for prosecutors to win a murder conviction against him. The remaining 3 men were charged with first-degree murder with hate crime enhancements. Hate crime enhancements are relatively self-explanatory, but just in case, they are the state and federal laws in the United States to further protect against crimes committed on the basis of specific characteristics, including race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. The prosecutor in Gwen's case, Chris Lamiro, like many of the news articles and media outlets that covered Gwen's story, simply did not do it in a way that was respectful or accurate to Gwen. If you go online and read the way Gwen's story is written, it's a shame the way that she is misgendered and marginalized, and the prosecutor was no different, stating, quote, "One can debate the propriety of one choosing to identify with a gender other than the one that they were born with. I trust juries to understand that people don't get to make life or death decisions simply based on someone's lifestyle. That is not a world in which I want to live, or most people want to live in." And the whole statement just rubbed me the wrong way, because I take it to mean this. We can sit here and judge Gwen for choosing to identify as female even though she was born a male, but that's still no excuse to murder someone. If you ask me, the whole entire first part of the prosecutor's statement could have been completely omitted, and the truth of what he said would have been infinitely more powerful. Nobody gets to decide who lives or dies, period. Magidson, Meré, and Cazares were set to be tried together. Jury selection began on March 15, 2004, and the trial began a month later on April 14th. I want to be clear that the prosecuting attorney presented his case in a way that continued to be disrespectful and dismissive of who Gwen was. He referred to her as Eddie, and he used male pronouns when speaking about her, when he said things like, quote, "Make no mistake, Eddie's death was an execution. The defendants decided that the wages of Araujo's sins of deception were death," unquote. But the prosecutor did refer to Gwen using female pronouns when speaking of her in general, though when talking about her as a murder victim, he switched to male pronouns. As for the defense, it was their contention that the defendants were being overcharged with murder and that they should rather be charged with manslaughter according to California law. Magidson's attorney would claim that he acted out against Gwen because he basically lost all sense of reason when he learned that he had sex, quote, "with a man," unquote, and that his actions were a result of what is termed at trial as gay panic. And this would be the basis of Magidson's and Merrill's defense, this gay panic defense. Let's pause here for a moment to discuss this. So the gay panic defense, and now also the trans panic defense, which may have been more of an accurate term that might not have been as prevalent at the time of Gwen's death, is a defense strategy that seeks to have a crime victim's sexual orientation or gender identity be the cause of a violent response on the part of a defendant. In other words, it's victim blaming, which is inherently never okay. But in cases like Gwen's, it appeared to be an acceptable defense. And in her case, it was a way of attempting to mitigate the murder charges into something lesser, such as manslaughter, or even find the defendants committed a justifiable homicide. So yeah, you heard that right. This is not only meant to claim that Gwen's gender identity doesn't just explain their actions, but it also excuses them as well. They felt like they were deceived, they lost control, and this caused them to assault her, ultimately killing her. And if we, as a civilized society, are okay with this, either partially or fully acquitting killers of crimes committed against any LGBTQ victims based on this gay or trans panic defense, then the implication is that their lives are worth less than others. And this simply is not the way our justice system is supposed to work. There are 3 ways that the gay or trans panic defense has been utilized to mitigate down a murder charge. One is to use it as a reason for insanity or diminished capacity, that the actions of the victim that resulted from their sexual orientation or gender identity somehow triggered a breakdown within the defendant, and this led to the panic, which led to the assault and the subsequent killing. Interestingly enough, this particular defense is actually based on a very obsolete psychological term called the gay panic disorder. And this had long been debunked by the American Psychiatric Association and removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders way back in 1952. But despite that, the terminology continued to be used in courtrooms for decades to come. The second way the gay or trans panic defense is used to justify a killing is the defense of provocation. In this situation, the defendant will claim that the victim made some sort of advancement, often termed a non-violent sexual advance, and it was enough to cause the defendant to lash out in violence and kill the victim. And honestly, all this defense does is bolster the damaging idea that a perceived provocative advance, which by the way is neither illegal or harmful, but apparently if it were to come from an LGBTQ person, then it is perceived as harmful enough to provoke violence. And the third way the gay or trans panic defense is utilized is when a defendant is claiming that the victim was going to cause them serious harm, injury, or even death in a situation that was related to their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. Using gay or trans panic as a defense to justify a violent reaction towards the victim is extremely detrimental to the LGBTQ community in its entirety because it implies that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity in some way makes them more of a threat to personal safety and to society as a whole. And besides, if we're talking a murder charge, this defense often misses the mark, especially if the defendant obviously used a much more tremendous amount of force than what would have been reasonably necessary, where the victim ends up dead and the person who killed the victim ends up on trial for murder. Unfortunately, gay and trans panic defenses have been successfully used in defendants being acquitted of murder, and it has been used as recently as April of this year. Even if juries are told to disregard any notion of gay or trans panic, the mention of an implied homophobic or transphobic bias could potentially have an influence on a jury. When it comes to whether or not a victim from the LGBTQ community has the right to life, should not be influenced by a defense born out of fear and ignorance, as everyone's life should be equally protected by our laws, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Today, there has been some legislation that no longer allows the use of gay and trans panic defenses, but many states have not enacted any legislation outlawing it altogether. Advocates are still working on getting the laws changed at state levels to ban this defense across the country. So far, this form of defense is banned in California, Illinois, and Rhode Island. Legislation is pending in New Jersey, Washington State, and Washington, D.C., and it will soon be introduced in Pennsylvania. And in July of 2018, just a little more than a month ago, the Gay and Trans Panic Defense Prohibition Act of 2018 was introduced to the U.S. House of Representatives, which, if passed, will ban this defense at the federal level. So, the trial of the murder of Gwen Araujo began, as I said, on April 14th, 2004, and the attorneys for Michael Magidson and José Meré would claim that their clients were shocked beyond reason when they learned that they, quote, had sex with a man. Jaron Nabors was going to be the star witness for the prosecution, but the defense attorneys tore into him, accusing him of lying in order to get a sweet plea deal from the prosecutors for his part in Gwen's murder. He was accused of being a cold, calculating, selfish person who has lied and is continuing to lie to save his own skin. He was accused of being one of the primary aggressors in the attack on Gwen, but was willing to throw his friends under the bus, placing the blame for her murder squarely on them. During a blistering conversation, he was told, quote, "You were in it up to your neck. You're holding back, aren't you? You're guilty as hell, and you're lying." But Nabors held his composure, and he described in vivid, chilling detail what happened in those early morning hours of October 4th, 2002. I've gone over the details of what these four men did to Gwen, and much of that came from his testimony, so there is no need to go through it again. But the jury did hear it, straight from him, and it was a callous attack, and he laid it all out for the court. This was carried out by a group of men who had absolutely no remorse for what they'd done. Neighbors did, however, make the suggestion that the anger and violence may have been justified because he suggested that his friends were raped by Gwen, accusing her of forcing Magidson and Meré into sex by deceiving them about her gender identity. Neighbors would admit that he had been untruthful in the past, but was testifying completely truthfully to the court, while pointing out that he did not think the 11 years that he was sentenced to was exactly a sweet deal. On June 22, 2004, after 9 days of deliberation, the jury announced that they were hopelessly deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous decision in the case against Magidson, Meré, and Cazares. While they agreed that Gwen had been murdered but could not come to a consensus as to whether or not it was premeditated, Gwen's family could be heard quietly gasping and crying. The jury had the option to convict the 3 defendants of either manslaughter or second-degree murder as well, but they ended up rejecting both of those options. They agreed it was murder, much to the relief of those closely watching this case, as the jury had resoundingly rejected the notion that Gwen's murder was a crime of passion. The prosecutor immediately indicated that he would retry the 3 men a second time. Trial number 2 began on May 31, 2005, and Magidson, Meré, and Cazares were again charged with first-degree murder with hate crime enhancements. But again, the jury would also be given the option of second-degree murder or manslaughter in an effort to avoid another mistrial. But there were some significant changes that were made in order to make sure the public was aware of the strategies that the defense utilized in order to cast blame onto Gwen for her own murder. Advocates for the transgender community created a great deal of publicity surrounding the case, educating the public about the manner in which the defense used trans panic to victim blame Gwen. This significantly shifted the manner in which trial number 2 was going to play out. Also, the day after the mistrial was declared, Gwen's mom, Sylvia, submitted a petition to have her name legally changed posthumously, which a court granted to her, and this, in turn, would require the defense lawyers to use female pronouns when speaking about Gwen. In the first trial, Gwen was referred to using male pronouns, even by the prosecutor. And in the second trial, this time around, all 3 defendants would testify on their own behalf, and all 3 of them pointed the finger of blame at each other. After 1 week of deliberations, the jury announced that it had reached a unanimous decision. However, they were deadlocked on the case against Jason Cazares, with a 9-3 split in favor of conviction for murder. Both Magidson and Meré were found guilty of second-degree murder, but they were not convicted of the hate crime enhancement, which to me did not make a whole lot of sense when I read the statement one of the jurors gave to the San Francisco Chronicle, which said, quote, "The community standard is not and cannot be that killing is something a reasonable person would have done that night. But this was not a hate crime, since the murder was believed to have been committed not because Gwen was transgender, but to cover up a situation that had gotten out of hand," unquote. For me, I wholeheartedly believe they murdered Gwen exactly because she was transgender. Michael Magidson and José Meré would go on to be sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the second-degree murder of Gwen Amber Rose Araujo. To avoid a third trial, Jason Cazares ended up pleading no contest to manslaughter at the end of 2005 and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. As of today, Jason Cazares and Jaron Nabors are long out of prison. José Meré was paroled in 2014, surprisingly with the support of Gwen's mother, who believes Meré has demonstrated genuine remorse. Michael Magidson, however, is still incarcerated at Valley State Prison. Gwen was murdered at a time when her former high school was organizing a performance of a play called The Laramie Project, which is about the 1998 murder of 21-year-old Matthew Shepard, a gay college student in Laramie, Wyoming. Matthew was murdered on October 12, 1998. He was robbed, beaten, tortured, tied to a fence in close to freezing temperatures, and left for dead by Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, who were arrested not too long after the attack when incriminating evidence was discovered in their vehicle after they returned to town following their attack on Matthew. Matthew succumbed to his injuries 6 days after the attack. His killers would go on to be charged and convicted of first-degree murder. If you would like to know more about Matthew's case, as he certainly deserves his story to be told and known, and I'm just running out of time here today, but I can highly recommend that you take a listen to the Matthew Shepard episode on the Magidson podcast, hosted by Brad Dunshee. And dreamers, bring your box of tissues when you hit play. And the reason I bring this up is because in my Google searches about the Laramie Project, I came across a very powerful article from November 20th, 2015, which is the annual Trans Day of Remembrance. It was written by Meredith Talusan, an LGBTQ staff writer for BuzzFeed. Normally, I would like to take the time to paraphrase the gist of the article, but honestly, it's worth telling in its entirety, and so I'm going to share it with you as we are reaching the conclusion of our story today. I was in an online chat room in October of 2002 when someone asked me whether we had heard about the girl who was killed not too far from where I lived in San Francisco. Her name was Gwen. A group of guys beat her up hours before she died, someone typed. She slept with a couple of them, and then they found out she had a penis. My first thought, why did Gwen put herself in that situation? But of course, I knew why. I put myself in Gwen's situation many times, trying to find affirmation at a time when a trans woman like me was either someone to hate or a fetish object with no option in between. Back in 2002, I thought it was my obligation to disclose as trans to possible partners, not because of my safety, but because it was somehow the worst type of deception if I wasn't upfront about my status. People understand if you don't divulge other sorts of private information on a first date. Alcoholism, being adopted, whatever. But somehow, being attracted to a trans woman who hasn't had bottom surgery is such a harmful affront to a man's sense of self that even other trans women made me feel as though the potentially violent consequences of non-disclosure were my own responsibility. Yet I couldn't help but keep my trans status to myself, repeatedly, because it felt safer. I've had several experiences of disclosing to men who hit on me at parties or bars, just to realize 15 minutes later that everyone around me was in on the joke, laughing openly at me. It was often hard to tell whether it was safer not to tell the one person who was pursuing me or risk an entire party knowing my status, when I might have just become the target of any stranger's hate. At the time, the world taught me that even when it was those men who approached me in the first place, the fault still lay with me if something bad were to happen. Just by being assigned male and dressing in a way that would cause others to perceive me as a woman, it's already my fault. Our fault as trans women when we are shouted at with slurs, beaten, or worse. But still, What happened to Gwen, I could not even imagine. I was already out of college. She was a vulnerable trans girl in high school, at a time when being cute and finding acceptance in others, especially boys, is often the most important thing. California is one of those odd states that has pockets of trans acceptance. But Gwen lived in Newark, 40 miles away from the Bay Area. For her, San Francisco might as well have been that unreachable queer oasis in a desert of straits. Yet Gwen dared to be who she was. She dared to present the way she saw herself as a young woman. And when men began to see her the way that she wanted to be seen, she decided not to tell them about her history. And when they found out, their hate and disgust drove them to murder her. I went to a vigil in Gwen's honor on November 8, 2002, on the opening night of Newark Memorial High School's production of the Laramie Project. Moises Kaufman's play about the death of Matthew Shepard in Wyoming in 1998, an event that became a rallying point for preventing anti-gay violence in the United States. That vigil was not so different from the others that I've been to since, involving candles and words remembering the fallen, recalling Gwen's spirit and life. My friend Robin shot the video of that night, of the gathered crowd, some dressed as angels, and we all strained to light candles in the rain. Both Gwen's lawyer, Gloria Allred, and her mother, Sylvia Guerrero, spoke about Gwen's life and her conviction in her womanhood, even though they and others repeatedly shifted back and forth between pronouns and names. Allred asserted her conviction that Gwen's killers would be brought to justice, and Allred asked the crowd to shout the refrain, "We have no doubt, we have no doubt." What I remember most clearly now is the way that Matthew Shepard and Gwen Araujo were treated, as their cases were really similar to each other. That Gwen was the victim of a hate crime, and her attackers needed to be brought to justice. Within the small confines of that supportive group, the possibility that Gwen's killers would receive the same harsh punishments as Shepard's attackers did, life imprisonment for first-degree murder, didn't seem so remote. But this wasn't the way things played out in court. Gwen's killers received second-degree murder convictions of 15 years to life, while their accomplices were convicted of manslaughter and given 6 and 11-year sentences. In contrast, Shepard's attackers each got 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Even the prosecutor who secured the convictions in Gwen's case, Chris Lamero, said afterward, quote, "I would not further ignore the reality that Gwen made some decisions in her relation with these defendants that were impossible to defend. I don't think most jurors are going to think it's okay to engage in sexual activity knowing they assume you have one sexual anatomy when you don't." In other words, Gwen was culpable simply for having sex as a trans woman who has not had bottom surgery. Even when I and other trans women give a myriad of reasons why upfront disclosure is not always practical, the way it puts us in a position to either risk widespread ridicule or be expected to remain largely celibate, many people still believe that it is our responsibility to disclose. It is our responsibility to give people we barely know information that can cause us great harm. And if we don't tell them, and if they find out anyway, any potential violence is our fault for not telling them. I would like to think in 2015 that trans women are in a better place. The trans panic defense is banned in California, in part because of the legacy of Gwen Araujo, but it is still legal in the rest of the country. More than 20 trans women have been killed this year in the United States, almost all women of color, while violence against gay men has significantly diminished. What began as confidence in a legal system that could fairly try Gwen's killers has, since her death, become nothing but doubt. Matthew Shepard and Gwen Araujo have been directly compared each other in 2002, but in 2015 the enormous differences in their positions have come to light. Many people who think gay people should not be harmed just for acting gay or demonstrating affection in public still think trans women are at least partly at fault for expressing our gender whenever we are harmed. And because people continue to think this, trans women are still put into a position where violence against us is our own responsibility. No case illustrates this better than that of Cece McDonald, who accepted a plea bargain in 2012 and spent nearly 2 years in a men's prison for killing a transphobic attacker in self-defense because she was afraid that a jury would convict her simply because she was walking around the world as a trans person. But at least McDonald lived. For trans women and gender non-conforming femmes who have died, and for the thousands of others who experience harassment and violence on a daily basis, the harm to our bodies and our psyches is the price we pay for being who we are. And as far as we've come, the Trans Day of Remembrance, today, November 20th, is still important. In the 13 years since Gwen Araujo's death, we continue to live with the same ignorance and danger that cost that young trans woman of color her life, have claimed the lives of many others, and stand to claim the lives of many more. And this is why we must remember and fight. Thank you for joining me for this 61st episode of California Dreaming. I need to take the time to thank Shelton Kuntz for reaching out to me in regards to this episode. In a comment thread in the discussion group regarding the topic of transgender women in particular, and the need to disclose their gender identity to intimate partners, he raised his concerns about approaching the topic in a way that would not be damaging or hurtful to the transgender community, which, as an LGBTQ youth advocate, he has seen happen while listening to podcasts discussing transgender topics, particularly crimes against transgender individuals. Shelton gave me a wealth of advice, guidance, and encouragement, and also gave me more confidence that I would tell Gwen's story with respect and dignity, which I hope I did. This was a very difficult story, but Shelton made it a little bit easier for me. So thank you. Thank you for all you do for the young people you work with. You have a big heart, and I am so glad that I've gotten to know you. Please join us on the discussion page on Facebook, where you can leave your comments and feedback about this story, as well as all the other stories we have covered. But as a reminder, we must be respectful of each other, as well as respectful to the victims of the stories we discuss. Often, our discussions are so good and insightful, and I really hate it when I have to shut it down because things begin to escalate. The things you tell me or share with me are things I draw from, and I can often share in some of the episodes. Your personal stories and a variety of opinions that differ from my own, so we can all have a voice about the topics we talk about. And I don't like having to censor that because it becomes verbally combative. So let's try a little bit harder to keep it friendly. Most of you do, but it happens. You can also find us on Instagram at California Dreaming Pod and on Twitter at California Pod. Don't forget, if you need more California Dreaming, For as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to the bonus content on California Dreaming's Patreon. And if you are a current Patreon subscriber, please join our sister page at KD2 Postmortem. It's an exclusive discussion page for patrons only, so if you subscribe, don't forget to request to join that discussion page as well. And California Dreaming is proudly brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We are a podcast production company located in Los Angeles, California, with a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to consistently improve upon our current roster of shows, and to develop new content that appeals to people all over the world, and to provide a thriving community for listeners and podcasters alike. I, for one, am so very proud to be a part of an amazing group of shows and hosts, including The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Super Nerds UK, 41 Owned, Historium, Vox Arcana, and The Podience. So please visit us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You can also find the links to all of our shows, our merchandise store, the blog, and if you just want to email us and let us know what you think, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, sweet dreams.